Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies' first workshop, What Makes Climate Assemblies Work. It's a delight to welcome you today after last night's successful formal launch. And I hope some of you, I recognize names that some of you were already with us then. For others, it's the first time you're joining us. This is all part of our of the launch of the network, the formal launch, and also this workshop, just to get a sense of the kinds of things that we might be doing over the coming weeks, months, and years. So those of you who weren't here yesterday, the Knowledge Network aims to bring together the knowledge and expertise of policymakers, practitioners, academics, civil society activists, and previous members of assemblies to explore challenges in the design and application of climate assemblies, and to promote good practice for those organising and advocating for assemblies. We fully recognise that climate assemblies are not the only form of climate engagement, but the current level of interest means that it's important for us to better understand the conditions under which they work well. So how does Knoca hope to achieve these goals? Well, through a number of ways, through events like this workshop, learning calls, and the like. Collating existing resources on climate assemblies, such as research, evaluations, videos, and podcasts. Collaborating on, and where possible, commissioning research on what is useful for practice. And collaborating on, and where possible, commissioning training for those wishing to undertake climate assemblies. Knoca is a network, so we need to find ways of doing this collaboratively, and hopefully today will be the start of some of those collaborations. In today's event, we'll be combining two types of activities. The first is discussion of emerging findings on climate assemblies. And the second is beginning the process of collaboration on setting the agenda and priorities for the network, including an opportunity for you to consider how you would like to contribute. So in the run-up to the launch, Knoca commissioned 4 research briefings to begin to answer the following questions. How does framing of climate change affect the practice of climate assemblies? How can climate assemblies be integrated into the policy process? What is the impact and legacy of climate assemblies? How can the legitimacy and resonance of climate assemblies in wider society be ensured? These are not the only questions we could have asked, but they are ones that are repeatedly raised. Climate Outreach, the Danish Board of Technology, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, and the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies took up the challenge to produce drafts on a ridiculously tight timescale. We thank them for that, and we apologise for setting such a timescale, but we wanted something that we could engage with today. So today we're going to consider those drafts with presentations from authors, reflections from invited commentators, and an opportunity for you all to provide your thoughts. Our question is how these drafts might be developed, both for the final version of the briefing and for future research in these areas. We've created whiteboards, which we'll share with you, or Jamboards for the technical term, for each paper for you to add comments as the afternoon progresses. Here you can leave comments about what you liked about the paper, what you think is missing from the paper, and questions for further research. In the final session of the afternoon, we'll start a conversation about the priorities of Knoca, asking you to consider what aspects of climate assembly practice need our attention, what sort of activities and events should we facilitate, and what contribution you can offer to the network. I've just realised I forgot to introduce who I am. I'm just this random person who's just appeared and just talking about the network. But my name is Graham Smith. I'm Professor of Politics at the University of Westminster, and I'm your host for the day. I'm one of your hosts for the day, and I'm I'm honoured to have been appointed chair of the network. For now, though, let's turn to our first panel and the first 2 draft briefings. And this session will be moderated by Diarmuid Torney, who is one of the fellow founders of Knoca. So Diarmuid, it's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Thanks very much. And can I say that Graham is the ideal person to have chairing Knoca. Not only has he written the book, he's actually written several of the books on the topic of deliberative democracy and environment. So we are in excellent hands, guided by Graham's leadership. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diarmuid Torney, and as Graham said, I'm one of the founding members of Knoca. You're all very welcome to this session 1, in which we will consider how the design of climate assemblies can be used to drive climate action. Over the next hour, we will hear the views of 2 of the 4 draft, we will hear overviews of 2 of the 4 draft briefing papers that have been produced in advance of today's launch of the network. These 2 papers focus on framing of climate change within climate assemblies and the integration of climate assemblies into policy systems. And I will shortly introduce the speakers who will give these overviews. Following these 2 short presentations, we will have a round of reactions from our expert discussants, Professor Maria Jose Sanz, Scientific Director of the Basque Center for Climate Change, and Dr. Giovanni Alegretti, Senior Researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. We will then have some time for a general question and answer session. In this regard, please add questions to the Zoom chat box throughout the session as questions occur to you. I'll just go over some of what Graham said about the use of whiteboards. So we have set up virtual whiteboards to capture your feedback and thoughts on the 2 briefing papers that will be shortly presented to us. And we will have a second set of whiteboards for the second session, when we'll hear about the second 2 papers. The link to the whiteboard will be posted in the Zoom chat, and I would ask you to click on that link and to take a minute to familiarize yourself with the platform we are using. And as Graham said, that platform is Google Jamboard. There will be 1 link required for the 2 papers we are considering in this session. So there'll be 2 sheets within that 1 Google Jamboard. The first sheet will correspond with the first paper we'll hear about, and the second sheet will correspond with the second paper. And as Graham said, each whiteboard sheet will contain 3 questions. What you like most about the paper, what if anything you think is missing, and questions for future research. Additionally, if you have any more detailed feedback you would like to provide on any of the briefing papers, please feel free to send this by email to info@knoca.eu. That's knoca.eu. We will be using all of the feedback received today, either through the Jamboard, the whiteboards, or by email, to inform the further development of the 4 briefing papers. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon. Chris Shaw is Senior Programme Lead for Research at Climate Outreach and a founding member of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. Chris will provide an overview of the briefing paper on framing of climate change within climate assemblies. Chris, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Diarmuid, and I'm going to, with much painful slowness, find which is the page I need to go to share my screen. Bear with me just a moment. Hopefully that's visible to you all. And assuming so, yeah, thanks very much. What I'm going to do, as Graham and Diarmuid have kind of suggested, is talk about this briefing paper that Climate Outreach have authored. And this looks at how does the framing of climate change affect the conclusions reached in climate assemblies. Now, this is a big question, as all the briefing papers are addressing big questions, and I'm not certain that, well, I know this briefing paper doesn't answer conclusively that question. What it does do is look at some of the evidence that informs the discussion and understanding of the influence of framing on climate change and assemblies and the conclusions reached in those. and also suggests directions for future research. So what do we mean by framing? Why is it so important for climate change assemblies or climate assemblies? There's many different definitions of what framing means, but this one is kind of a pretty much a standard one, George Lakoff. So the same information, when given a different label or title, will give a different understanding and in theory generate different responses, attitudes to the message being conveyed. So this framing, assembly, and the climate assembly itself is a form of framing, right? So it's actually setting up a particular approach to how we might understand and respond to ideas about climate policy. So that itself is a frame which we might expect to shape the kinds of information responses that people give in that space. Who's presenting the information? What kinds of information are being presented? What time, what weighting is given to the different types of information. These are all forms of framing that will inevitably shape how people understand and respond to the process and what their responses to that might be, which again, is important when we think about how do we build a legitimacy, resonance, and a legacy for a climate assembly. How do we know that actually what we're hearing in that room, which is quite a unique and special space, it can be kind of extrapolated beyond that space and be representative of actually what people do genuinely think and feel about this very complex issue. And we can recognize that climate change has many dimensions. It's political, it's scientific, it's ethical, it's economic, it's scientific. There's so many different ways that one can approach this topic, all of them equally legitimate perhaps, but then again, one has to think about the decisions that are made about what element of the climate change debate one is bringing to the fore. And one way that's expressed, one way that is manifest, is actually what is the climate assembly set up to do? What title is it given? What is its objective? What is its remit? Now that itself is a form of framing that dictates what's going to happen in the room. It also infers a certain sense of what is the right answer or what would be the appropriate response. So that's an important part of the framing. And what I'm going to do in this very short presentation is just go through some of the insights identified in this draft of the paper, look at some of the recommendations, and as I say, these are just signposts really to for future work in this area. So that's one thing, it's great to have a really distinct policy remit for a climate assembly, because otherwise it's a very abstract, complex phenomenon for most people. So that's great that it makes it tangible for people. So that's a really important part of the framing process. But also we notice there's a tendency to focus on mitigation. There's not really, climate assemblies aren't solely focused on adaptation. They're not often given very much time to adaptation, discussions of adaptation. Well, what does that mean? What are the possible implications of that? To my mind, one of those implications is that it says what we discuss in this room will be a solution to climate change and there won't be any need for adaptation. It's almost like, well, we don't need to talk about it because we're talking about solutions. But of course, as we know, the science is clear. Even the kind of best case net zero scenarios still imply profound change, profound impacts on climate change. So how do we actually bring people into that debate about there's things we need to do, but there's also to mitigate, there's also things we need to do to live with the unmitigated consequences of climate change. So these are important elements of the framing that we need to understand better to better develop assemblies that produce outputs that can drive forward climate action. Another thing is about the presentation and deliberation. So many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the literature that says a deliberative space, such as a climate assembly, kind of replicates an idea of us as rational actors, that we will make a cost-benefit decision on the basis of the information that's presented to us by experts. But actually, that can be quite intimidating for some people, that space. They're not familiar, they're not happy, and they're not comfortable, not confident in that space. So that's a way of framing that can have an impact on what we're hearing in the room. Is it legitimate? Is it actually kind of authentic, what we hear from people? Or are they just trying to tell the experts what they think the experts want to hear? On a plus side, the solutions-focused orientation of these mitigation climate assemblies, the literature tells us, is a very good way of bringing people into the debate. If you just put the science in front of people, put the impacts, that can be quite intimidating if there's no actual kind of path or possibility of action in response to that. And you know, assemblies I've been involved with before, some kind of activist groups said, well, the purpose of the assembly is for people to run from the room screaming, you know, in fright of what they've been told, rather than being engaging with solutions. That's the proper purpose. So the literature says that would not necessarily be a productive way to go. And the literature is very clear that for, you know, lay audiences, and for all of us really, values are at least as important, if not more so, than technical information and how people respond to these kinds of messages, this framing and news about climate change. So what it actually is the proper role of the balance of information and values in this space, so that those values can come to the fore and are not swamped by information. And how does a framing of this, being with experts standing up, providing PowerPoint presentations, how does that shape the way that people choose to respond or feel able to respond? So these are all key aspects of framing that are shaping responses in ways we don't really properly understand. It's under-researched at the moment. So what can we do moving forward? Well, one of the possibilities to think about is this idea where everything is thrown into an assembly: value stuff, ethical stuff, technical stuff, scientific stuff, and there's a real rush, as we will find this afternoon, trying to cover this territory in the short time we have. Should we consider actually sequencing assemblies so that they're just much more specific on a particular topic, and what are the implications of framing the assembly in that kind of way? And as I think we're in agreement within the kind of founding members. I think that there's a real gap there for assemblies that focus on adaptation as well as those that focus on mitigation. But again, should they happen within the one assembly, or should they be treated separately? Yeah, and finally, just to say, I think the design assemblies need to sort of formally and on an evidence-based process understand how to balance the presentation of information and space for expression of values and how those are to be negotiated. And also, we know time and time again, people who go to climate assemblies, this is great, everyone should do this, why isn't everyone doing a climate assembly? So I think there's an opportunity to really build on that enthusiasm and use that value base, when people come out with their own values, and exploit that enthusiasm as willing kind of peer communicators to help spread the outputs from the assembly in a way that's framed in a way that's kind of relatable for lay audiences, as it were. I'm going to stop there. It's a bit of a rush through, but I think that hopefully we can we can discuss this in a bit more depth in a moment.
Chris, thanks very much for that succinct overview. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Frederik Landkjaer, who is project manager at the Danish Board of Technology and another founding member of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. Frederik will provide an overview of the briefing paper on integration of climate assemblies into the policy system. Frederik, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And just as Chris, I'm just going to share this presentation that I think you can see now. And yeah, hello, nice to see you all. My name is Frederik. I'm a project manager in the Danish Board of Technology, and I've been working on this paper on how climate assemblies can be integrated into the policy process. And I should just say from the start that it's based on a literature review on one hand and a number of interviews on the other with people involved in some of the existing climate assemblies. And then I should also say that climate assemblies are still few and that they vary significantly in their designs and the political context. So it's difficult to make any type of generalizations at this point, but the following insights and recommendations that I want to present to you are preliminary indications of what we can see as of now. So what do we mean by integration into the policy process? I guess that you could say that climate assemblies can have different purposes and institutional setups, but that they are typically established to provide inputs for policymaking from ordinary citizens. And that's why it's crucial to consider how they relate to the policy process, which could be something along these lines here. So who's commissioning the assembly, and who are the receivers, and what is their commitment and response? And what is the role of the parliament, government, and civil servants, and what is the timing, the task, and the context of the assembly? So, for example, is it elected representatives, governments, or non-governmental actors commissioning the assembly? Are they also the receivers, and how are they committing to simply respond to the assembly's recommendations, or are they also intending to implement some of the recommendation in different ways? And if they commit to respond, how do they commit to respond within certain timeframes, or in public or in private? And in terms of the roles of parliament, government, and civil servants, they might be involved in different phases of the assembly, before, during, or after. So both initiating, mandating the assembly, but also the design and the implementation of it, and especially the follow-up. And then, does the assembly feed into something in specific? Is it a matter of forming opinion, or setting an agenda, or looking over something? And is it related to a certain policy, or just a matter of getting a general input? And I guess these considerations are important, among other things, because they affect the level of trust in the process, the independence and legitimacy of the process, and empowerment and motivation of the citizens, usefulness of political object, of the output, accountability, and etc. So just to give you an overview of some of the insights that I think we can see as of now. First of all, the attitude of policymakers towards citizen participation is important. Without some kind of interest in these kind of assemblies, they won't be commissioned by policymakers. And even though they are commissioned by policymakers, they might still have different types of attitudes toward it that can affect their engagement in the process, and whether and how they commit to respond to the assembly. So, for example, the Danish politicians have been criticized for not being engaged in the Danish assembly. And this might be related to the fact that the assembly was a suggestion from the Green Party, and that the other parties are not necessarily that familiar with this concept. And in France, there's also been some tensions between the government and parliament, because citizens were asked to come up with legal proposals that to some parliamentarians were seen as a threat to the legislative role. Then there's also something about the link between the assembly and the policy system, and that can be either tighter or looser. So if assemblies are commissioned by governments and parliaments, they're tighter, they have a tighter link, and have a higher chance of direct policy impact. And you could also include political representatives as assembly members, or in the organization of the assembly in other ways that might give a tighter link to the policy system. But then again, there's a potential that this might undermine the independence. So there's constantly a balance that you have to strike between political ownership and the independence of the process. Then the climate assemblies we've seen have been mainly consultative, which also mirrors the broader practice of citizens' assemblies. And you might say that the French case is the one that's been closest to being empowered, with Macron promising that the proposals of the Assembly would be brought to the appropriate level, unfiltered, as he announced. And then the last thing is that the work of the Climate Assembly is typically not timed in relation to specific policies, and their remits are usually broadly scoped. So, for example, the remit of the Irish Assembly was how could Ireland become a leader in climate change, whereas the French one was to define structuring measures to manage in a spirit of justice to cut France's greenhouse gas emissions. And you have other examples too, but they've been very broadly scoped. And in terms of their timing, it has mostly been a matter of getting an input from these assemblies and not feeding into concrete policies. However, in Scotland and UK, there have been some considerations concerning the COP26, and in Scotland and Denmark, the assemblies have also been supposed to comment on or feed into climate change plans, but they have both been postponed because of COVID-19. But it would be interesting to experiment more with having more specific remits and also having assemblies feeding into specific policies and more specific parts of the political process. And based on these insights, we've come up with some recommendations that you might consider moving further. First one is that climate assemblies should be initiated by a broad political coalition that engages both parliament and government. So I think this is crucial to the clarity of the remit, as well as the commitment and response to the recommendations. So, for example, in Ireland, the Assembly was established by a broad coalition in Parliament through a resolution proposed by the government. And there's a resolution both described parts of the design, the remit, and the response and follow-up process for the Assembly, which made the process and the task and the expectations of the Assembly clearer. And the Irish case also indicated that involving Parliament and not just government in the follow-up process might increase impact. So relatedly, the political remit, commitment, and follow-up process of climate assembly should be clear. Because if there's a lack of clarity, this might lead to frustration and civic disaffection with politics, which climate assemblies should try to fight. So for example, in France, Macron said that he would bring the recommendations unfiltered, but did not respect this initial commitment, which was heavily criticized and disappointing to the participant of the assembly. And this clarity is important, no matter whether the assembly is empowered or it's more consultative. And then climate assemblies should be organized independently of policy actors. So with an independent secretariat, delivery organizations, and steering groups in which members of the assemblies are represented in order to ensure the legitimacy and the credibility of the process. And it seems that this is easier to ensure if there's a broad political coalition behind the establishment of the assembly. And then the last thing is that time and resources need to be spent on building capabilities, capacity and support for citizens' assembly amongst civil servants and political expected to respond before assemblies are organized. So again, the attitudes of policymakers are important and crucial to whether we're going to establish climate assemblies in the first place. But given that we do decide to do so, we also need to allocate the needed time and resources to do it in a proper way. And that was all. Thank you.
Frederik, thank you very much for sticking to time. You're all making my job as chair very straightforward. I realized that I partly repeated Graham's mistake of not properly introducing myself. I told you my name, but I was a member of the expert advisory group to Ireland's Citizens Assembly for its deliberations on climate change. So I was particularly interested to read the account of the Irish Climate Assembly in the paper by Frederik and his colleagues, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University in Ireland. And the next step is that we will hear responses from our two expert discussants. But before introducing them, can I remind you all to please use the virtual whiteboard to provide feedback on the briefing papers. I understand from the chat that there has been some technical difficulties with that. I've been looking at it myself, and there seem to be quite a lot of people logged into that now. So hopefully those technical glitches have now been resolved, and everyone is able to access the whiteboard, the Google Jamboard successfully. Once we hear from our two discussants, there will be about 20 minutes for a general discussion. I would encourage you to put questions in the Zoom chat box, or if you feel comfortable doing so, there will be an opportunity for people to unmute themselves and ask questions, to speak directly to the rest of the participants. There's about 90 of us in total, 89 of us in total, but hopefully we'll be able to manage that. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first of our expert discussants. Professor Maria Jose Sanz is the Scientific Director of BC3, the Basque Centre for Climate Change. She is a well-recognized expert in climate change policy, land use, air pollution, carbon and nitrogen cycles, and greenhouse gas inventories, among other topics. Maria Jose has been working closely with the Spanish Climate Change Office to set up the Spanish Citizens Assembly on Climate to start in autumn of this year. The Climate Change Office just closed a consultation on the organization of the Assembly, and we heard an update on its progress during yesterday evening's session. I had the particular delight of hearing Maria Jose just an hour ago. She was the keynote speaker at a conference, the annual climate change conference organized by the Environmental Protection Agency of Ireland, and she delivered that keynote address literally one hour ago. So Maria Jose, it's very nice to see you once again in such a short space of time, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Good morning, Diarmuid. Thank you very much for your nice introduction and inviting me. I have to say that I read with pleasure the paper that Christopher presented. And I think the challenge defines very well why the paper is so helpful. Is that we need to promote the depth engagement of citizens in these exercises of climate assemblies. And when I was reading the key insights and the recommendations, it came to my mind a series of issues that matched those. No, for example, I mean, when citizens think about climate change, they don't usually distinguish between mitigation and adaptation in their daily lives, and that reflects quite well the key insight that most of the climate assemblies are dealing with mitigation, but no adaptation is being dealt with. So if we want to have citizens deeply engaged, one interesting aspect will be to combine adaptation and mitigation, or at least deal with adaptation as well. Another issue that came to my mind is complexity. Yes, the assemblies are being the ones that have been celebrated already. They break into subgroups in order to digest this complexity, and obviously it means that probably one single assembly will not be enough for citizens to embrace all these complexities. There is also this tension in between the need of or the sense of citizens that we need deep changes in our development. At the same time, we have very uncertain information provided, and therefore they also look for solution-focused orientation, which helps in the debates, which was another insight of the paper, which I found very interesting. And one of the ones that really interest me more, and I think Diarmuid knows, is is complexity versus the expert bias. I mean, how we can make sure that the concept, very technical concepts around climate change are conveyed in a way that citizens can really digest them, and they are not interpreted previous to the knowledge is being put forward to the experts. Because sometimes experts, they have their agendas, and I can have one single example that I presented in this conference 1 hour ago, which is how we see forest, the role of forest in the climate change. And in some cases, this is being interpreted through experts' agendas more than by some real facts. There is also the problem of the elites and the specialized jargon that is used in climate change so far. How we translate that into the citizens' assemblies in a way that they are able to assimilate the information, they are confident that the information is neutral, and of course they can also ask for additional information to whoever they deem necessary. And that is another point I think is also very important, trust. You know, generating trust is important, and it's not only about trust on our on who demands the assembly and our policymakers or our politicians. It's also to generate trust within the assembly itself, so that the citizens, they trust each other, and they all have honest deliberations, and not only among the citizens and the policymakers. So, in this context, I think values were brought into the debate in the paper, which I think is also very important, because values are the basis for generating trust, values and respect. And finally, two things which I also believe are important is that we need to ensure the capacities of the citizens are either way, they are complementary or they are more or less at the same level. Because people learn in different things, and we have to respect that. And this is one of the other insights that was found. And finally, I think ownership and empowerment. I mean, but ownership in the sense of owning the process, and then ownership will be reinforced. And I jump into Frederik talk a little bit. It will be reinforced by how these recommendations are taken by the promoter of the assembly. So I think the paper really have a very nice, insights which fit with these concepts, which we all have in mind, and they are not unique to citizen assemblies, but they are critical for them. So thank you very much, Chris, for the paper and the presentation.
Maria Jose, thank you very much for your intervention. Our second expert discussant is Dr. Giovanni Alegretti, who is an Italian senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. His main areas of research include citizen participation in the management of budgeting and territorial management. Giovanni is, and the Center for Social Studies will coordinate for 4 years the Phoenix project, selected by the European Commission to support European capacities for citizen deliberation and participation for the European Green Deal. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to read the papers, which were very interesting. I will try to complement what Frederik wrote, especially from the experience I got in my 5 years as co-chair of the Independent Authority for Participation of Tuscany. So indeed, I think that the issue of how to link democratic innovation and policy actors is the key point. For the credibility and the authoritativeness of the process, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, especially as different culture has different tensions and trust in elected officials and institutions, and also in the consideration that they will give to the remits. Working for an independent authority, I experienced how I was regarded as an enemy and a competitor by many institutions because I was not inside of them, and so I was not plasmable, no, somehow in their vision. So fragmentation of participation in many streams under many commissioners was the strategy used to silence the most impactful democratic innovation. So when democratic innovation works, in many cases is through corridors or to ambassadors or people that are already personally open and sensitive and sometimes isolated from the system and the political, including their parties, to participation. But as you Frederik said, it's very important so to have from the beginning a broad coalition putting together executive and legislative powers, and to prepare in advance and train a civil servant and other technocracies which have not a friendly culture for participation and can act as hidden gatekeepers, so being promoters or being blockers of policies, changing results on the way to implementation. I would add one thing, the judiciary, because I think it has been an important actor, but still needs to be fertilized on participation. So in this previous training, possibly we have to reflect on the role the judiciary can have. And even some third independent agency, for example, I found good allies in the Commission of Environmental Assessment when political powers boycotted or bypassed the results of democratic innovation. They were the friendly allies for us. So I think working with them could be, from the beginning, could be interesting also. Obviously, I think the centrality is in the construction of steering groups that you list as an important thing, because they can grant the independence of the organization of the assembly, but at the same time connection and insider perspective from the beginning. So the idea is that of a more manageable and protective system within a large ecosystem of powers and trust relation that we cannot control totally. No? So a second reflection is that impacting policies at large is also impacting public opinion and the possibility that the private sector and citizens at large could feel responsibilized in the implementation of policies through changes of lifestyle and behavioral patterns, which I think are fundamental for the success of many policies in all the fields of environmental and ecological policies. Yesterday, it was discussed if recommendation has to be directed also to other actors than institutions, and I think this is a qualifying, could be a qualifying point. And I finished saying that maybe for that, three things could be important. The first one is that the co-design of the roots of the mini public in society could include a variable geometry, which in some phases opens to a larger series of inputs, because the trust in the assembly as a somehow representative space of different positions in society is not necessarily conquering everybody. There are a lot of people that, as some researches on the French Climate Assembly shows, that they could not feel properly represented by it. So it's important to open in order that the Climate Assembly in itself could be felt by a larger number of people as something that is worth to take into account. The second issue is the need of obviously of having a variable geometry of topics also, but maintaining a line of interest and the debate on compensation, in the sense that compensation are those things that are intended, those actions that people can help people to feel the change of behaviors and rules as an opportunity more than a burden. And so I think it's very important to have this line, because in many cases compensation are offered by public actors, but they are not discussion as a list of priorities with people. And the third thing is related to legal frames. I think that I see legal frames more than as an obligation, more than a tool for providing clarity of rules and roles, and also of commitment, as you said. So these are central for reducing frustration. Some cases it seems that it's better to underestimate the assembly result than to over-illusioning people on how the remit will impact society and policies. And so law frames can maximize investments and effectiveness, the use of personnel, of expert, of counter-expert, of communication techniques. Timing is a fundamental dimension, but there is another one, which is the need in many cases of freezing the administrative decisional paths of some decision while the assembly are ongoing. Because it happened to me that the politicians change rules and policies on issues that were being discussed with people. And people felt that this was a way to destroy all the time they were giving to this public commitment. So finally, I want to finish saying that I think, as you say, mini public are stronger when anchored to institution than from the beginning, because when they are in invited spaces, they are felt by politics as a bridging arena to society. While if they are proposed by bottom up, they continue to be felt in the domain of claimed space of participation. So in participation by eruption, so what a good social movement and NGOs and good lobbyists already do. And we don't have to forget that we are in a world dominated by social construction of reality. So feelings are fundamental in every phase, and readjustment beyond the good faith of institution could be needed during the assembly. And that's why I think ongoing monitoring and evaluation, and possibly participatory evaluation and assessment, are fundamental. And I think the Knoca has a real key role in the next years for taking into account the importance of this social construction of reality. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for that intervention. So we will now move into a general discussion. We have 20 minutes remaining in this session. And as I said earlier, you're welcome to pose questions in the Zoom chat box, and I've been monitoring that. If you feel comfortable doing so, you're welcome to speak to the group directly. If you wish to speak, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. You'll find it on my version of Zoom. It's under the reactions tool. So if you would like to speak to the group, please raise your Zoom hand. I might kick things off with a question that picks up on one of the tweets that was put out by Robin Dents in response to last night's session. And I think this spans across both papers, in fact. So the tweet was an observation that the terms growth, neoliberalism, and capitalism didn't occur or didn't come up in our discussions yesterday evening. And so the question, I guess, for the framing paper is, to what extent the framing of climate change and the framing of our approach to climate change should be constrained by existing socioeconomic paradigms, and to what extent we should try and think beyond those. And the parallel question to the integration paper would be, how does that shape the integration of climate assemblies into the broader policy system? So Chris and Frederik, would either of you like to comment on that?
Happy to pick up the framing question in the first instance, if that's useful. And it's a great question. I think one of the goals of Knoca is to be able to work productively with a broad range of social actors, and that's policy actors and broad range of the public. And I think it's a bit of a tightrope to navigate that. I'm always attention. I'm always navigating about with my sympathy to perhaps the very real fact that say climate change is a justice issue. There is no resolving climate change without resolving kind of historical injustices, etc. But then there's also the issue of if one goes into this process with a strong kind of systemic approach, overthrow the system is the only way forward kind of agenda or framing, that has challenges for who would want to come into the room, building connection with policymakers, etc. afterwards. Would it just be, well, justice not, would it be seen as kind of more of an activist space with less resonance across the broader sections of the public? So I think that is, I know many people do struggle with that issue, and I think it is a, about this, what is the remit? Why would citizens, why are climate assemblies necessary? What are they about? Who is it who's coming into the space? Many people wouldn't be able to, get involved in that discussion about, say, colonialism, historical oppression, climate change, and injustice. That would just alienate a lot of people. So I think it is a difficult issue. So it comes down to this point. So is it that, one does, what is it that we can achieve in climate assemblies? What is it that climate policy can achieve? Is it going to be about political and systemic change? Is it going to be about technological change? Is it going to be about just decarbonisation of the existing kind of social and economic systems? These are all unasked questions. At the moment, I would suggest that climate assemblies sit broadly within a framing that doesn't challenge the system, and where it has done, say for France or wherever, the political traction has been somewhat limited and people have been disappointed. So these are important questions. I don't think I've done justice to them. I don't have a clear answer. This attention I'm always navigating, and I will continue to, and I'm sure many of us in this space do, but it is a great question and something that we should be continuing to try and progress a decent answer to.
Thanks, Chris. Frederik, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Just a few comments. I mean, I guess, what did you mention? Growth, neoliberalism, and something third. I guess to some extent they're conditions and they're already there. So at least in the remit of the Danish Assembly, the citizens were asked to take into account public finance, cost efficiency, employment, sustainable business development, and Danish competitiveness. So I guess some would interpret that as being some kind of presence of a certain paradigm. You might call it neoliberal paradigm in that remit. But as also Giovanni mentioned, I guess policy impact is not necessarily only going through the legislative branch or the executive branch of representative democratic institutions, but also having an impact on civil society, having an impact on the private sector, and I guess that those stakeholders should be engaged in the process in one way or the other, and whether the citizens, I guess, I mean, these processes are supposed to be on the premises of the citizens, right? So I guess it's up to the citizens whether they want to challenge those paradigms and those thoughts, or whether they want to, or whether they think they're reasonable and want to take them into account. But at least the voices of those stakeholders should be there and be included and addressed.
Thank you very much, Frederik. I see Yves Saint-Amé has his hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes. This is a question for Frederik. You have presented one model which seems to fit for all, but I feel it as strongly linked to the consensual political model of the Denmark and other countries. And don't you think that the context should influence the model? And that in countries with a much more adversary political system, such as France, the model should be different. In France, the organization committee of the convention was highly politicized. The members of the convention had relations with ecological movements, participated to events. This had negative side effects, but it was also a condition for the high visibility of the French Convention and for putting it at the center stage. It would perhaps have been much less visible with your model. So the question is context and model. Just one model which fits for all?
Sorry, but can you just elaborate on what you mean by one model or a consensual model?
Well, for example, in the French Convention, the organization committee was composed by people who were activists, partly, who were politicized, who had political interests, not by neutral experts. It was not forbidden for citizens who were part of the convention to get in touch with social movements, to engage in political organizations and so on. So it was a much more politicized process, but perhaps it fits more with the French political system than your model, which is more technical and more consensual.
Thanks. I definitely think that the different assemblies should be contextualized, so moderated or modeled so that they fit the specific given political context. So I'm still not sure whether, I mean, there have also been involvement of stakeholders in other climate assemblies, so I'm not necessarily sure what you mean by consensual, but definitely it should be allowed for citizens to hear from the people they want to hear from, get inputs from the people that they want to get inputs from, and deliberate with them so that they receive all the perspectives that they need in order to discuss the different problems or challenges that they want to discuss. And that's certainly very contextual and context dependent.
Thank you, Frederik. And perhaps that's a question that Knoca will be getting to grips with. I think the broader question is whether a model of best practice will emerge over time. Is it just that we are in the early phases of the institutionalization of climate assemblies, or is it irreducibly context dependent and path dependent? If anyone else would like to contribute verbally to the discussion, feel free to raise your hand. In the meantime, I might pick up on a question from the chat and bring all of our contributors, both the presenters and the two discussants, in on this question. And I think it speaks most closely to the framing paper, but it's a question from Laurie Moulton Ulrich about the focus on climate change and whether that should be broadened to ecological interdependence, Laurie suggests. But a parallel question might be whether to frame the mandates of climate assemblies in terms that are that perhaps resonate better with people's everyday concerns, perhaps focusing on co-benefits, or and possibly linking in with other looming challenges like digitalization, artificial intelligence, the future of work, and so forth. or are we better sticking off with, you know, kind of packaging climate change as a standalone topic? So I might start off with you, Chris, on that question. Actually, sorry, before I bring you in, Chris, just to mention, I think we had some further difficulties with the Jam boards, but they are now back in action, as far as I understand. So if you were locked out of them, please re-engage with them, because I gather they are back functioning again, and apologies for the technical difficulties. So Chris, I might ask you to come in first of all, and then invite our other three contributors in on that question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really key. When we run a lot of focus groups, they're not assemblies, they're kind of more extractive research tools with members of the lay publics, and they don't, they see that a world out of balance. That's a frame that seems to resonate, strongly. And that may be about seeing digitization of the world, seeing their children spend all their time on screens. It may be the degradation of the natural environment. It could be a whole lot of things. Climate change is one of a number of signs of a world out of balance for many people. So I think there is much to be gained from thinking about framing or approaching these conversations in that broader context. So again, would commissioning bodies be interested in that? They're obviously often quite instrumental and focused on what they want to get from it. I won't say any more than that, because it'd be great to hear from other people in the few minutes we've got left. A great question again.
And Giovanni, your screen is saying no. I'm not sure, does that mean you don't want to speak, or you do want to speak?
No.
Do you have any questions on that question?
I lost it because I had a moment of disappearance. Can you repeat me?
Okay, so,
please, sorry.
The question really is around the framing of questions for climate assemblies, and whether climate change should be the framing, or should it link to biodiversity, or indeed link to broader, life concerns of ordinary citizens.
I think that the framing would have to frame the climate change with his sub questions about mitigation and adaptation within a larger framework of anxieties of society, because I think that a better way to attract somehow to attach people to the experience, we must somehow bring them where we would like to go, but also through attracting them in showing interested to what are their anxieties. So I think we need like something in the middle, a frame that respect the point of view of those who are called to come, and the concern of who is setting the space for the discussion. That's because of the issue that I was saying before about the social construction of reality. I think it's a double hand of meeting and midpoint together, showing interest for the other.
Sure.
Sorry.
Giovanni. Maria Jose, would you like to comment on that, or any of the other discussion we've had?
I mean, I think on my side, I believe that, as Giovanni said, I mean, the social constructions are quite complex, and I think we are dealing with two types of democracy: the representative democracy, where we have this affection by the population, the citizens, and this deliberative democracy, it could be an oxygen balloon to the democracy as a whole process that society needs to construct. So in my view, it's extremely important that we get things right and better, and an analysis of what is being done so far is fundamental, but we also have to respect that the context may be different, the cultures are different, and these also conditions how things need to be performed. but yet there are some commonalities that that merit to be you know, understood and capitalized from the processes that are being done and are going to be done in the near future.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. We're coming to the end of this session. We have just a couple of minutes remaining, so I'd like to hand back to our two presenters for any concluding remarks they have. Chris, I'll start off with you.
Thank you very much, Diarmuid. Yeah, so I think as we've heard and seen in the chat, etc., there is no view from nowhere. You know, social reality is constructed. To pretend there is a view from nowhere, as I think was William Morris said, is to do a disservice to what's a very important debate in the face of a very urgent crisis. So I think we do need to make some decisions as we move forward with climate assemblies about what it, you know, where do we stand? What is our perspective? What is that vision that we're looking for? What is that world that we want? And perhaps, you know, just to be kind of upfront about that and build in that authenticity to assume there is actually a value neutral answer to the predicament we place out there to be found through this process.
Thanks very much, Chris. And Frederik, last word to you.
Yeah, sure. I think I just want to say that it's still sparse what we know about this type of integration of climate assemblies into political processes, and that I think it's going to be interesting to develop our understandings further, and especially to see if we can get to know more about these different links between the assemblies and the policy systems, getting into more detail about the different ways that people work. So people in the different steering committees, people in the administration, the politicians, where they're present in the different phases of the assemblies, and also to get a greater insight into the different roles that the different actors play.
Great. Thank you very much, Frederik. And thank you to all of the contributors to this panel, to Chris, to Frederik, to Maria Jose, and to Giovanni. I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's been a great start to this afternoon's webinar, a very rich discussion. There is, I know, an even richer discussion taking place in the chat. We will be saving that and harvesting that. We'll also be gathering and harvesting all of your comments in the whiteboard. And a reminder also that if you have more detailed feedback to provide on these two or two of the two subsequent briefing papers, please send those comments by email to info@knoca.eu.